A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Welcome to another edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company for Wednesday, September 28th. Glad to have you with us on the program. My first story at Bearing Arms today was about the Journal of the American Medical Association. Its latest issue is sort of dedicated to quote-unquote gun violence, which in many cases, unfortunately, is just an excuse for academics and researchers to write about the supposed need for more gun control laws. I did not find a single piece in the latest Journal of the American Medical Association that viewed gun ownership as even a right worthy of protection, much less a positive good, which is problematic. I mean, there have been some surveys of physicians that have shown views towards gun ownership and views towards groups like the American Medical Association taking a stance on gun control are not particularly popular among the medical community. There is a pretty big divide, and yet this was a pretty one-sided issue when it came to how to address, quote-unquote, gun violence. Today's guest, however, is the lead author of a new study. He and his colleagues have put together, taking a look at violent crime rates, or actually crime rates in general, with gun sales. Is there any connection between the two? Of course, gun control advocates say, yes, more guns equals more crime, which is why we need to not only have more gun control laws, but we need to reduce the number of gun owners in this country. Dr. Mark Hamill, who is a trauma surgeon and an associate professor at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, found differing data, to put it mildly. No connection between gun sales and crime rates. Does that disprove the more guns equals more crime hypothesis? Well, I would say so, but let's find out what the good doctor thinks. Here's our conversation with Dr. Mark Hamill. Take a look and listen. Dr. Hamill, thanks so much for coming on Cam and Company today. It's great talking with you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Just been looking forward to it.
And it's great to see this new study out because, anecdotally, I've always said it's the whole idea that more guns equals more crime. All you have to do is look at crime stats and know that that's not true. Crime rates in this country over the course of, 200 plus years tend to rise and fall in waves that don't correlate to the number of guns that are sold or the number of guns that are in the hands of Americans. But that's just anecdotal evidence. That's just me looking at, one set of crime stats. You actually and your colleagues actually decide, all right, let's dig a little bit deeper. And what did you find when you started looking at the rate of NICS checks? Because there is no, perfect way to know how many guns are sold every year. But when you started looking at the number of NICS checks performed versus the country's crime rate, were you able to come up with any correlation?
No, well, I mean, it depends on how you look at it. And I think that's the problem with any research into firearms or really anything, is it really depends how you run the numbers. And when you look at grossly, just gross number of background checks, or which again we're using as a surrogate for legal firearm sales, and gross crime numbers across the spectrum. What we saw is, of course, there was a correlation as background checks and firearm sales went up, that crime went down. But I think that is unfortunately a very simplistic way of looking at things, and that's one of the things. Is if you're going to look at this, you've got to look at it kind of using it robust modeling to make sure you don't introduce kind of unintentional errors into your analysis. What we ended up doing is looking at it a little bit differently and looking at it at the state level, what happened within states over time, and comparing essentially one state to another state, and kind of taking into account that rates within states are very correlated from one year to the next. And, to me, not surprisingly, what we found was there really is no correlation with any of the major crime or homicide indices that are out there and, increased level of firearm sales.
So that, again, I'm not surprised by that. I'm sure that there are some folks out there who are, because particularly over the last couple of years, I mean, there have been no shortage of advocates for more gun control laws, and even some researchers themselves who say, look, we saw this massive increase in gun sales in 2020. At the same time, we saw the biggest crime spike that this country has seen in at least 30 years, if not longer. Those two things must be related.
Mhm.
Is there anything that in your study, which did not go up to 2020, I believe, but is there anything that would indicate that those folks might be onto something?
Well, I think you look at it, and it all depends on the time frames you're looking at. And I think as I brought up in my study, there was a study around Sandy Hook, where researchers did the same thing. They looked at the about year period around Sandy Hook, and said, oh well, something, gun sales went way up over this time, and crime, and there were increased, crimes involving children, and and deaths involving children with firearms. And I think, on face value, they make a little bit of a compelling argument. But when you dig a little deeper, and they even acknowledge this, is that when you look at very limited time, it's very difficult to account for things outside the specific things that you're studying that could account for the changes. And that, I think, is one of the things which we did. We looked at a relative long period of time. So any outside factors will probably kind of ebb and flow over that period, and the effects will be limited by looking at the much longer time period. And I think that's the problem. And the other thing is, the chicken or the egg. Is the gun sales, the gun sales causing the increased crime, or is the crime causing the increased gun sales? Anecdotally, and we hadn't discussed this, but I was a New York City cop before I went to medical school, in the mid '90s, and this was when we were seeing a huge amount of crime in New York, and quite frankly, it wasn't the people who legally own guns in New York City that were the problem. And I think that's the crux of the issue, is that the people who legally want to own the gun firearms are, for the most part, a very law-abiding group of people.
Hmm.
And a lot of the crime is probably driven by people who are not law-abiding citizens. In fact, I would argue that the bulk of the crime is probably driven by people who are not law-abiding citizens. And that's the problem. Is, I mean, a study like this does not account for sales that occur illegally. It also, by its very nature, it can't account for face-to-face sales between people. There's no way to account for that in most states in this country.
Hmm.
But at least when you're going through a firearms dealer, and purchasing either a new or used firearm for a firearms dealer, there really doesn't look like there's any association with changes in crime rates over time.
Yeah, so I want to go back to something you just mentioned, where you talked about your experience as a police officer in New York, and obviously, I think the response from those who would say, no, 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 we do need to limit access to firearms, is that, well, look, New York City made it incredibly difficult for people to own firearms, made it even more difficult for people to carry them. So, of course, we would not expect to see that body of people commit a lot of crimes, because we, double and triple checked to make sure that they were law-abiding citizens. We had character references. We went through their tax records. Boy, I mean, we combed through their past with a fine-tooth comb. And now the Supreme Court says, these good cause requirements have to go away. More people are going to be carrying. That opens the door for less responsible people carrying firearms. But you and your colleagues also took a look at concealed carry rates in violent crime. This has been a couple of years, right?
Yeah. We published it in the Journal of the American College of Surgeons in 2019, and we looked at changes in concealed carry legislation on a state level over almost 30 years. And over that period, there was, just about every state, at the beginning of the 30-year period back in the '80s, many states did not allow civilian concealed carry of firearms. Over that 30-year period, every state in the country, ended up putting in some form of concealed carry legislation for civilians, and many of them went to a kind of shell issue, or even this was the beginning of the constitutional carry trend at that point. And quite frankly, we found the same thing. Is that when you adjusted for it rigorously, when you use rigorous statistics to look at it, there was no association with the liberalization of civilian concealed carry laws and the and crime. Again, that goes counter to some of the narrative that's out there. But there's some data. You look at some of the data by Dr. Lott that's out there, and he has some studies looking at, as a group, civilians who carry firearms concealed and have concealed carry permits are more law-abiding in a lot of places than police officers. They have a lower arrest rate. They have a lower, it's kind of amazing when you look at that, and that seems kind of counter to some what I would think, but again, and no situation is going to be perfect. I mean, the background checks. I mean, I think we've seen many times in the last several years where the background check system has failed because the data was not entered in a reasonable fashion. So
Hmm.
I think that background check's only as good as the data that's entered into it. And unfortunately, just like I mean, some people are going to commit crimes, and some of them are crimes of passion that occur suddenly, and that's very difficult to control for. I mean, as a police officer, I saw crimes of passion with firearms. I saw crimes of passion with butcher knives.
Yeah.
You see that, and that's very difficult to control for.
It is, and again, I mean, I think anybody who's promising, a utopian crime-free society, no matter what their proposal is, I would disregard that advice. You're right; we're always going to have that certain criminal element. But again, I think when we talk about the debate over gun ownership, and right now, the Journal of the American Medical Association, their latest issue is dedicated basically to combating gun violence. I took a look at the list of topics, and it's pretty much all in favor of a public health approach to combating gun violence. It sure looks a lot like, let's put new gun laws on the book. Let's put red flag laws on the books, universal background checks. Let's ban these guns. We need gun licensing to own a gun. We need gun licensing to carry. Those are the types of proposals that are being put forward legislatively from, the Journal of the American Medical Association. You also have other folks who are talking about, maybe non-legislative areas for, fighting like maybe violence interrupters and things of that, these sort of gun violence prevention groups. But, I didn't see anything in that recent journal that I would say even viewed gun ownership as a positive, or even simply a right that should be protected, right? That's concerning to me, just as a gun owner and as a Second Amendment advocate. How concerned are you as a doctor that the medical profession itself is sort of putting its thumb on the scale when it comes to research and advocacy, sort of leaning towards one solution, quote unquote solution, without considering all of the data, all of the research, and frankly, the laws of the land?
Yeah, I think that is a great point. I will be frank and say I suspect much of the medical literature on this has a fair amount of bias that occurs with it. I even encountered that in getting this paper published, where medical literature goes through what's called a peer review process, where you have other people review the literature and kind of make comments and make suggestions. And we had some great comments and made some edits to the paper, from the initial draft versions. But the initial journal that I submitted this to, one of the reviewers, we went through a couple layers of edits, and then came back to the final. We had answered all their questions in it, and the reviewer basically came back and said, "Well, you've answered all my questions, and I can't find anything major, but I don't agree with it, so I'm going to recommend they don't publish it." Okay, I mean, I okay, that's your prerogative as one of the reviewers, but I think that kind of goes against the spirit of the peer review process, which is to try to improve things. I think one of the problems with the medical literature on any firearms related topic is that in many ways, as they say, we're going to look at it as a public health problem, but they disregard the other literature from other social science fields that are out there, which legal literature, there's criminal justice literature, there's many of the social sciences have literature which looks at this, and quite frankly, they all have very different conclusions, depending on the lens that you look at the topic through. I mean, you can frame things as public health, and that's you get one conclusion. You frame things from a legal standpoint, you get another conclusion. You frame things from a criminal justice standpoint, you get a slightly different conclusion. And I think that's the fatal flaw of a lot of the medical literature, is that it looks at this and it only looks at it through the lens of medicine. I mean, I'm a trauma surgeon. I see this. I see violence committed with firearms day in and day out, and it's generally not people who legally are possessing firearms. that are the victims. I mean, sometimes it is, and sometimes there are very tragic results from bystanders and things like that, and that it's horrific. But in many cases, it's not. In many cases, it's people involved in some sort of crime that are the victims and the perpetrators. And I think you've got to look at that. And I think the in general, medicine is looking at this through a very limited, through a very narrow lens. And I think that's a problem. And I also think that if you don't have consensus on this, and that's something the Rand Corporation recently looked at, is how can we figure out a way to move forward with this? And one of their conclusions was that consensus is what's needed. You need to find the areas where you can get some consensus where changes make sense. I mean, quite frankly, I also think that new laws aren't necessarily the answer, but enforcing a lot of the laws that you already have, has a lot of potential. And these days, when you have, people with the criminal justice country has changed significantly in the last few years, and I think that is a problem. That is probably some of the violence that you're seeing and some of the changes in crime rates that you're seeing now. But,
yeah, listen, I'm not going to disagree with you. We have a segment on this program every day called the Recidivist Report, where we literally and I have no shortage finding these stories, of a repeat violent offender in the criminal justice system who just keeps kind of going through this revolving door, right? And you wonder, how many times is it going to take before the criminal justice system actually steps in and there are consequences for these crimes? And I think you're right that there again this is and maybe it's maybe the legal side is looking at it from a narrow legal window, and the medical community is looking at it from the narrow medical lens. But I think you're right about the sort of narrow approach that we see in some of these disciplines when in reality I think this is a complicated issue, and I don't know that. I wish that there was a simple answer. I wish it were as easy as, well, let's just do this one quick thing and bloop, the problem is solved. I don't think, unfortunately, that is the case. But I do appreciate you and your colleagues putting this study together, because I do think that it is really valuable in terms of just, again, finding out what it is that we're really supposed to be looking at and concentrating on. And if the idea that, well, more guns automatically leads to more crime is simply not true, then let's talk about, well, what does lead to more crime? And maybe we can focus our efforts on trying to stop those things as opposed to trying to prevent legal gun ownership, or viewing that as the sort of, model treatment when it comes to fighting gun violence. I'm curious, now that this paper is published, do you and your colleagues have any endeavors planned for the future? Are you looking at some other areas of research?
We do. I don't want to, again, not having done anything yet, I don't want to tell it. I don't want to get.
You don't have to tip your hat, but I'm glad to know that you're not stopping here. Let's leave it. We can leave it with that.
We have a couple other things planned. It takes some time to put this together, and again, we want to make sure. In the end, we want to make sure we do it right.
Yeah.
We don't want to do something. Something kind of, preliminarily. We want to make sure we get it right when we do it, because it doesn't make sense to give something that someone can really shoot holes in. I want to do quality. I want to do quality work when it comes to that. We all want to do quality work.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you again spending some time with us today talking about this quality work, this new study that is out. Dr. Mark Hamill, thank you again for your time. Thanks for everything you do, not just in terms of the research, but the lives that you save each and every day. I really appreciate it, and hope we get a chance to talk again soon.
Yes, sir. Thanks a lot, Cam.
Thank you. Dr. Mark Hamill joining us here on Bearing Arms Cam and Company. Well, I do appreciate Dr. Hamill joining me on the program. Look forward to seeing what he and his colleagues come up with, although it might be a couple of years. But I want to have Dr. Hamill back at some point just to talk about, well, whatever's in the news. I think his perspective as a former law enforcement officer, now a trauma surgeon, I think that gives him a really unique perspective. And frankly, I'm just interested in talking more with him in the future. So hopefully we'll be able to bring him back onto Cam and Company at a later date. Right now, let's turn our attention to today's Recidivist Report, our armed citizen story, and our good deed of the day. We'll start with our Recidivist Report. This one actually not dealing with violent criminal, not the most recent charge. But the website CWB Chicago has the story of a 13-time felon who pickpocketed passengers on the Chicago Transit Authority while out on bail, for pickpocketing passengers on the Chicago Transit Authority, as well as robbery. Yeah, 13-time felon. You got to try hard. And you have to have some help from the criminal justice system to be a 13-time felon, don't you? Albert Fields is his name. He, again, 13 previous felony convictions, including murder in 1981. 2 years ago, the website CWB Chicago reports he was charged with robbery, theft, and identity theft for crimes that he committed while he was allegedly working with a pickpocketing team on the train system in downtown Chicago. Charges filed in October 2020. Judge released him on his own recognizance. No bail needed. And then he went AWOL. Didn't show up for court. Just skipped out. Charges still pending, by the way. Case hasn't been resolved. But he was back in court earlier this week. Prosecutors say that he was part of a pickpocket team on the train system in downtown Chicago. Again, Chicago police saw the 66-year-old sitting on a bench on a Green Line station platform Monday afternoon. Recognized him as one of the folks that they've been looking for, so they arrested him. Prosecutors say that he stole a 44-year-old man's wallet on a Blue Line train back in June while an accomplice blocked the victim's path. Then the following month, he allegedly stole a wallet from a man from Missouri while two other accomplices blocked the victim's path. Prosecutors and prosecutors say that the CTA surveillance system recorded both of those thefts. And now he's charged with 2 counts of felony theft from a person. During Tuesday's bail hearing, his defense attorney said he has, quote, severe substance abuse issues. Okay. And that may very well be the case. But again, if you know that somebody has severe substance abuse issues, and you know that that individual has a proclivity for committing crimes, including violent crimes, because of those severe substance abuse issues, seems to me the state has a duty to intervene, right? And at this point, given the lengthy criminal history for Mr. Fields, outpatient drug treatment, probably not appropriate. Inpatient drug treatment may not even be appropriate. Drug treatment in a prison setting, however, might be appropriate. I have no problem whatsoever with the criminal justice system saying, all right, you know what, we got to deal with Mr. Fields' underlying substance abuse problems. And even at 66 years old, I don't think it is too late for Mr. Fields to address those issues. But the system's not addressing those issues. The system is giving Mr. Fields a slap on the wrist, sending him out back into the streets, knowing that because of his substance abuse issues, or let's say that maybe the defense attorney's wrong, and maybe this guy just really likes committing crimes for whatever reason. Every time the system lets Mr. Fields out, he is soon back again. Now, I would say that that is an untenable situation. But for the criminal justice system, in Cook County anyway, it's just another day's work. Today's armed citizen story from Tulsa, Oklahoma, where police are investigating after a burglary suspect was shot and killed by a homeowner. This was about 12:30 Tuesday afternoon. Authorities responding to a call of a shooting. When they got there, they did find a subject deceased outside of the home. Homeowner told officers that the burglary suspect climbed through the back window and was inside the residence when he was shot. Police said the suspect then went back through the window, ran to the front of the home before collapsing. No names have been released, neither the alleged burglar nor the homeowner. Tulsa police say it's still an active investigation, but at this point, everything looks like it's a case of self-defense. We will keep our eyes open for any details. Sometimes things change. You know, we had that story out of Milwaukee a few weeks ago where it originally looked like it was self-defense. And then it turned out it was self-defense, but in a drug house, and there were still some charges that the individual was facing. So we do bring you the updates when we can find them, and hopefully that'll be the case for this story out of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Finally today, our good deed of the day, in the right place at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing. An off-duty Dallas police officer who saved a woman after a fiery crash. This was late Tuesday night. The woman's truck apparently stalled along Interstate 30 near Jim Miller Road while she's calling for help, again with her truck just kind of stalled out. She was hit. Well, her vehicle was hit. 2 other vehicles actually hit her truck, and then the truck ended up catching fire in the middle of the highway. So this off-duty Dallas officer is just driving by. Again, like literally in the right place at the right time. And he was able to get her out of the truck moments before it was fully engulfed. She was taken to a local hospital. She is expected to recover. The other drivers were shaken up, but they were not seriously injured, thankfully. Dallas police have not released the name of the off-duty officer who saved the woman. I know, having had a car catch fire myself, how quickly vehicles can go up in flames and be completely and totally engulfed. So, again, thankfully, the Dallas police officer was there to extricate her to safety. I would also just tell you, if that ever happens, if your car ever stalls out, you're in the middle of the road, turn your hazards on. Really, I don't know if that was the case, but the fact that two different vehicles hit this truck, it kind of makes me wonder if they didn't realize what was going on until it was too late. So, do yourself and everybody else around you a favor. If for whatever reason your car gets disabled out on the road, hit those hazards so that the other drivers know to avoid you. And hopefully you don't have to get pulled out of the flaming wreckage of your vehicle by a very nice off-duty police officer. Now, that is going to do it for this edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. I want to thank you for being a part of the program as always. We will be back tomorrow with yet another edition before we wrap up the week. At least wrap up the week Cam and Company-wise. Of course, we cover the latest segment of news and information every day of the week at bearingarms.com, and I would encourage you to visit the website to get the latest news that you need to know about when it comes to your right to keep and bear arms. If you like what you see, I'd also encourage you to become a VIP member at Bearing Arms. All you have to do is go to bearingarms.com/subscribe. Use the promo code GUNRIGHTS, and you can get a significant savings on your VIP membership. As our way of saying thanks, we're going to give you exclusive content, news stories, and analysis you won't find anywhere else, because your support does matter, and it really does make a difference. So thank you again. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a great rest of your Hump Day Wednesday. Until then, be well, be safe, and be free.